This is part 2 of Twist Cottage by Anthony Horowitz. We're about to find out who the previous occupants were. Over the last few years, 6 different couples had moved into the place, and something horrible had happened to every one of them. A lady called Mrs. Webster was the first. She drowned in the bath, Carol said. Nobody knew how it happened. It wasn't as if she was old or anything like that. When they found her, she was all bloated. She'd completely swollen up inside. That was the first time Willoughby sold the house. It was bought by a second couple, a Mr. and Mrs. Johnson from London. Just 4 weeks later, one of them had fallen out of the window and got impaled on the garden fence. The next victim was a Dr. Stainer. Carol knew all the names. She was enjoying telling us her story, sitting in the living room of her house as the sun set and long shadows reached across the room. This time, it was a tile falling off the roof, she said. Dr. Stainer's skull was fractured and death was instantaneous. After that, the house was empty for about 6 months. Word had got around, you see, all these deaths. But eventually, Mr. Willoughby sold it again. I forget who bought it this time, but I do know that whoever it was had a heart attack just 2 weeks later, and the house had to be sold for a 5th time. It was bought by a Professor Bell. The professor lasted just 1 month before falling down the stairs. Also killed? John demanded. Yes, with a broken neck. And the house went back on the market once again. Poor Mr. Willoughby never thought he'd be rid of it. He didn't even want to handle it, but of course he was making money every time it was sold, even though the price was dropping and dropping. Who would want to live in a house where so many people had died? Was my dad the next to buy it? I asked. No, there was one more owner before you, an Australian, electrocuted while adjusting the thermostat on the deep freeze. There was a long silence. Either Carol had been talking for longer than I thought, or the sun had set more rapidly than usual because it was suddenly quite dark. You're not really moving in there, are you, Ben? John asked. I don't know, I replied. All of a sudden I wasn't feeling too good. Is this all true, Carol, or are you just trying to scare me? You can ask Mr. Willoughby, Carol said. In fact, you can ask anyone. Everyone knows about Twist Cottage, and everyone knows you'd be mad to live there. That night, I asked my dad if he knew what he was getting himself into. Louise was already asleep. She'd started drinking recently, and had got through half a bottle of malt whisky before dragging herself upstairs and throwing herself into bed. Dad and I talked in whispers, but we didn't need to. She was sound asleep. You could probably hear her snoring on the other side of Bath. Is it true, Dad? I asked. Is Twist Cottage haunted? He looked at me curiously. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. Who have you been talking to, Ben? He demanded. I was at John's house. John. Oh, his sister. My dad paused. He was looking very tired these days, and old. It made me feel sad. You don't believe in ghosts, do you? He asked. No, not really. Nor do I. For heaven's sake, Ben, this is the 21st century. But Carol said that 6 people died there in just 2 years. There was an Australian, a Professor Bell, a doctor. It's too late now, my dad interrupted. He never raised his voice as a rule, but this time he was almost shouting. We're moving there. He forced himself to calm down. Louise likes the house, and she'll only be disappointed if I change my mind. He reached out and tousled my hair like he used to when I was younger, before Louise came. You don't have anything to worry about, Ben. I promise you, he said. You'll be happy then. We all will. And so we moved in. I tried to forget what Carol had told me, but I have to admit I was still feeling a bit uneasy, and things weren't helped by two accidents that happened the very day we arrived. First of all, the driver of the removal van tripped and broke an ankle. I suppose it could have happened anywhere, and it wasn't as if a ghost had suddenly popped up and gone boo or something like that. But it still made me think. And then, at the end of the day, a carpenter who had been called in to mend a broken window frame slipped with a saw and nearly cut off a finger. There was a lot of blood. It formed something that looked almost like a question mark on the window pane. But what was the question? Why have we come here? Or what's going to happen next? In fact, nothing happened for a while. The next weeks were mainly spent unpacking boxes. There were piles everywhere, books, plates, clothes, CDs, and no matter how many boxes we unpacked, there always seemed to be more waiting to be done. A new dishwasher was delivered, and also a mower big enough to deal with the garden, a great beast of a thing that Dad had found second-hand and which only just fitted into the shed. Louise didn't help with anything. I couldn't help noticing that recently she'd become very plump. Perhaps it was all the drinking. She liked to sleep in the afternoons and shouted at us if we woke her up. Of course, I was out most afternoons. My dad had bought me a new bike, partly to cheer me up, but mainly because I now needed it to get to school. There was a bus I could catch into Bath from the nearby town of Bradford-on-Avon, but that was still a 10-minute cycle ride away. In fact, I preferred to cycle the whole way, following the canal towpath where Dad and I had often walked. It was a beautiful ride when the weather was good, and this was the summer term, warm and sunny. I'd leave the bus until the weather got cold. Twist Cottage had 3 bedrooms. Mine was at the back of the house with views into the wood. Well, all the rooms looked into the woods, as we were completely surrounded. It was a small room with uneven white walls that bulged slightly inwards, and a curiously ugly wooden beam that ran along the ceiling just above the window. Once my bed was in and my Arsenal posters were on the wall, I suppose it was cosy enough. But in a way, it was creepy too. All those trees cast shadows. There were shadows everywhere, and when the wind blew and the branches waved, the whole room was filled with flickering, dancing shapes. And there was something else. Maybe I was just imagining it. But the cottage always felt colder than it had any right to feel. Even in the middle of the summer, there was a sort of dampness in the air. I could feel it creeping over my shoulders when I got out of the bath. It was always there, slithering around the back of my neck. When I got into bed, I would bury myself completely under the duvet, but even then it would still find a way to twist itself round my ankles and tickle my toes. Dad was right. Louise did seem happier in Twist Cottage. She wasn't doing anything very much anymore. All her art stuff seemed to have got lost in the move, and she spent most of the day in bed. She was getting fatter and fatter. I often used to see her sitting with a magazine and a box of chocolates, with the TV on and the curtains closed. My poor dad had to do everything for her. The shopping, the cooking, the laundry, as well as his job at the university. But at least she didn't shout at him so much anymore. She was like a queen, happy so long as she was being served. And then the incident happened that very nearly removed Louise from our life forever. I was there and I saw what happened. Otherwise, I would never have believed it. It was a Saturday, another warm day at the end of August. Dad was in Bristol. I was at home mending a puncture on my bike. Louise hadn't got up until about 11 o'clock, and after her usual 3 bowls of cornflakes and 5 slices of toast, she had decided to step out into the garden. This was in itself a rare event, but like I say, it was a lovely day. Anyway, I saw her waddle down to the fish pond. She had a tub of fish food in her hand. Maybe her own enormous breakfast had reminded her that the fish hadn't actually been fed since we moved in. She stopped at the side of the water and tipped some of the flakes into her hand. "Here, fishy fishies," she called out. She still had a little girl voice. Something moved in the grass behind her. She didn't see it, but I did. At first I thought it was a snake, a long green snake with some sort of an orange head. But there are no huge green snakes in Avon. I looked again. That was when I saw what it was, and like I say, if somebody had described it to me, I wouldn't have believed them. But I was there, and I saw it with my own eyes. It was the garden hose, moving on its own. I was sitting there with a bicycle chain in one hand and oil all the way up to my elbows. I watched the hose slither and twist through the long grass while Louise stood at the edge of the water scattering a fistful of food across the surface. I opened my mouth to call out, but no words came. And then the hose looped itself around her ankles and tightened. Louise yelled out, losing her balance. Her hand jerked back, sending fish food flying in an arc behind her. She toppled forward, and there was a tremendous splash as she hit the water. It must have surprised the fish. The fish pond was deep and covered in slimy green algae. Despite the weather, the water was freezing. I have no doubt at all that if I hadn't been there, Louise would have died. It took me a few seconds to recover from the surprise. But of course, I dropped the bike chain and ran down to help her. No, that's not completely true. I didn't go straight away. I hesitated, and a horrible thought flashed through my mind. Leave her to drown. Why not? She's ruined Dad's life. She's made us sell her old house. She's cruel, she's lazy, she's always complaining. We'll be better off without her. That's what I thought. But an instant later I was on my feet and running. I wouldn't have been able to live with myself if I'd done anything else. I got to the edge of the pond and reached out for her. I caught hold of her dress and pulled her towards me. She was filthy and sobbing, her yellowing hair matted with dark green weeds. I managed to get her out onto the grass, and she sat there, a great lump, water streaming down her body. Did she thank me? I suppose you think that's funny, she moaned. No, I said. Yes, you do. I can see it. She wiped her hand across her face. I hate you. You're a spiteful, horrible boy. And with that, she stomped off into the house. The hosepipe lay where it was. That evening, I told my dad what had happened. Louise had gone back to bed after the accident, if that's the right word. She'd also locked the bedroom door so he couldn't have gone in even if he'd wanted to. I told him first that she'd fallen into the pond, and I described how I'd saved her. Then I told him about the hose. But even as I explained what I'd seen, I saw his face change. I'd expected him to be incredulous, not to believe me, but it was much more than that. He was angry. The hose moved, he said, repeating what I'd said. The 3 words came out slowly, heavily. I saw it, Dad. Was it the wind? No, there was no wind. It's exactly like I saw. It sort of came alive. Ben, do you really expect me to believe that? Are you saying it was magic or something? Fairies? I mean, for heaven's sake, you're 14 years old. Hoses don't come alive and move on their own. I'm only telling you what I saw. You're telling me what you thought you saw. If I didn't know you'd better, I'd say you'd been sniffing glue or something. Dad, I saved her life. Yes, well done. He walked out of the house and I didn't see him again that evening. It was only later, when I was lying in bed, I realised what had really upset him. It wasn't a pleasant thought, but I couldn't escape it. Maybe we would have been better if I had done what I was tempted to do. Maybe he would have preferred it if I'd left Louise to drown. My story is almost over, and this is where I have to admit that I actually missed the climax. That happened about a week later, and I was away for the weekend. Perhaps it's just as well, because what happened was really horrible. Louise got minced. She had been lying in the garden sunbathing, and somehow the mowing machine, the one I've mentioned, turned itself on. It rumbled out of the shed and across the lawn and towards her. She was lying on a towel, listening to music through headphones. That's why she didn't hear it coming. I can imagine her last moments. A shadow must have fallen across her eyes. She would have looked up just in time to see this great metallic monster plunging onto her, the engine roaring, the blades spinning, diesel smoke belching out thick and black. When the police arrived, Louise was a mess. Parts of her had hit the wall 20 metres away. Whenever a wife is killed in unusual circumstances, and circumstances couldn't have been more unusual than these, the police always suspect the husband. Fortunately, my dad was in the clear. At the time Louise had died, he had been lecturing to 200 students. As for me, I was in London, so obviously I had nothing to do with it either. There was an inquest a month after that, and we all had to go to court and listen to police reports and witness statements. The lawnmower had been taken apart and examined, and there was a report about that. But in the end, there could only be one verdict: accidental death. And that was the end of that. Except it wasn't. We never went back to Twist Cottage. I was glad about that. I thought of all the deaths that had taken place there over the years, and now Louise. It could have been me or my dad next. We moved into rented accommodation in Bath, and my dad took time off from university to sort everything out. I wasn't sure what would happen to us, where we would live and stuff like that, but now it turned out that we were actually very rich. It seemed an incredible coincidence, but just before we had moved into Twist Cottage, Dad had taken out an insurance policy on Louise's life. If she died as a result of an accident or illness, my dad would receive £750,000. Of course, the insurance company was suspicious. They always are, but the police had investigated. There had been an inquest. There was nothing they could do except pay. And so, we were able to buy a new house in Bath, just round the corner from the one we had sold. We tried to put Louise behind us. Everything began to go back to the way it had been before. And then one day, I happened to find myself at Bristol University. I'd arranged to meet Dad when he finished work. We were going to the cinema together, just like the old days. Only he'd got held up in a tutorial or something, and I found myself kicking my heels in the little square box that he called his study. There was a desk with a photograph of me, but not one of Louise, I noticed, and a scattering of papers. There were a couple of chairs and a sofa. 2 of the walls were lined with shelves, and there were books everywhere. I think there must have been 1,000 books. They were even piled up on the floor, half covering the window. I figured I'd read something while I was waiting, but of course, they were all history books. Then I noticed a Viz comic on one side of the shelves, and I reached up for that, but somehow my fingers caught one of the books, which had been lying flat out of sight. It slid out and toppled into my arms. I found myself looking at the cover. It was called Haunted Houses from the Elizabethan Age. I was curious. It was almost as if my dad had hidden the book right up on the highest shelf, as if he didn't want it to be seen. I carried it over to the desk and opened it, and there it was on the first page, among the chapter headings. Twist Cottage. I sat down, and this is what I read. One of the most famous witches of the 16th century was Joan Barringer, who lived in a cottage in the woods near Avencliff. Unlike many of the witches who were usually elderly spinsters, Joan Barringer was married. Her husband, James Barringer, was a blacksmith. Sometime around the year 1584, in the 27th year of the reign of Queen Elizabeth, James Barringer began an affair with a local girl, Rose Edlin, daughter of Richard Edlin, a wealthy landowner. It seemed that somehow Joan Barringer found out about the affair. Her revenge was swift and terrible. She placed a curse on the unfortunate girl, and in the weeks that followed, Rose Edlin became ill. She lost weight, she lost her hair, she went blind. Finally, she died. The recently discovered letters written by Richard Edlin showed what happened next. James Barringer was persuaded to testify against his wife. She was summoned to court on a charge of witchcraft and sentenced to death. The method of execution was to be burning at the stake. However, before the sentence could be carried out, she managed to escape from prison and returned to her cottage in Avencliff. The house was surrounded. The local villagers were determined that the evil woman should pay the price for what she had done. And it was then that Joan Barringer made her appearance, standing at an upstairs window with a rope draped around her neck. She screamed out a final curse. Any woman who ever entered Twist Cottage would die. She blamed women for what had happened to her. Rose Edlin had been beautiful and had stolen her husband from her. She had been ugly and would die unloved. Then she jumped. The rope was tied to a beam. It broke her neck, and she ended up dangling in front of the villagers, her head wrenched to one side. The last letter written by Richard Edlin reads, "And so we did discover that wretched, evil crone, a sight most horrible to behold. Her eyes were swollen and bloody, her fangs were drawn, and do she hung by her twisted neck beside that horrid twisted house." This is how Twist Cottage got its name. So Dad had known about the history of Twist Cottage before we moved in. That was my first thought. But there was more to it than that. I remembered how angry he had become when I had asked him if it was haunted. "For heaven's sake, Ben, this is the 21st century. That's what he'd said. But he'd known. He'd known that the house had been cursed, and that the curse only worked on women. Could it possibly be true? I used the telephone in his office and called Carol, the girl who had warned me about Twist Cottage in the first place. 6 people had died there, she had told me, and now she confirmed what I already knew. Mrs. Webster had drowned in the bath. Mrs. Johnson had fallen out of the window. Dr. Stainer had fractured her skull, and Professor Bell had fallen down the stairs. Both of them had been women. Another woman who had had a heart attack, and an Australian woman who had electrocuted herself. I thought back to the day we had moved in. The driver who had broken an ankle, and the carpenter who had slipped with a saw. Both of them had been women too. My head was spinning. I didn't want to think about it, but there could be no avoiding the truth. Louise had ruined my dad's life and had refused to give him a divorce. All along he must have wanted to kill her, but he couldn't do it himself, so he had moved her into Twist Cottage, knowing that, since we were both male, he and I would be safe, and had waited for the ghost of John Barringer to do the job for him. It was incredible. I put the book back on the shelf and left the room. I never, ever asked him about it. In fact, we never mentioned Twist Cottage ever again. But there is one thing to mention. My dad hung on to Twist Cottage. He didn't sell it. With all the money he got from the insurance, he didn't need to. But later on I found out that he rented it out from time to time. He demanded an awful lot of money. But the men who rented it always paid. It was always men. They would go with their cruel, nagging wives, or their screeching, senile grandmothers. One took his mother, another went with a peculiarly vindictive aunt. The women only stayed there a short time. None of them ever came back.